the voices that shouldn't exist. The story of the lost cosmonauts began long before the world heard the first beeps of Sputnik. In the early 1950s, the Soviet Union was already pursuing something far more ambitious than simply launching a satellite. Behind sealed bunker doors, deep beneath military research cities that didn't appear on any map, Soviet planners outlined a vision in which the USSR would dominate space at any cost, including the cost of human lives. On the surface, the official timeline showed carefully controlled steps, rockets tested, capsules improved, training refined. But the hidden reality looked nothing like the polished newsreels released to the world. Engineers reported unexplained test failures, recovery teams found capsules scorched beyond recognition, and internal memos spoke of unaccounted assets after rocket explosions. These assets were not equipment, they were people. To maintain the appearance of superiority, the Soviet leadership developed a culture in which failure became a state secret. Every unsuccessful launch was erased from public record. Every death in training was buried under layers of bureaucratic silence. Cosmonauts whose missions ended catastrophically were not mourned. Instead, they vanished, their names removed from rosters, their photographs quietly airbrushed out of group portraits, their families pressured into lifelong quiet. It was within this environment of secrecy that the first anomalies began to emerge. In the late 1950s, a pair of Italian amateur radio operators, known for tracking Soviet radar signals, began picking up transmissions that didn't match any known launch. They recorded irregular heartbeat patterns, rising carbon dioxide levels, and faint breathing that grew weaker by the minute. The signals were raw, unfiltered, and disturbingly human. Their equipment was old, unreliable, and unofficial, yet they captured something that suggested the existence of a mission the Soviets never admitted happened. Weeks later, Soviet radio silence was suddenly broken by triumphant announcements of successful tests and future victories. But these were accompanied by suspicious changes. Cosmonaut candidates who had appeared in state propaganda vanished overnight. Official biographies were rewritten, and in internal reports later uncovered, Soviet tracking stations had registered a series of unplanned spacecraft re-entries, each one ending far from any safe landing zone. While the USSR pushed ahead toward Yuri Gagarin's historic flight, the earlier failures became more difficult to conceal. Western intelligence analysts noted inconsistencies in launch numbering, telemetry data gaps, and unexplained rocket debris recovered by foreign governments. Rumors circulated inside the intelligence community about capsules destroyed in orbit, oxygen system failures, and bodies burned on impact. None of these claims could be proven at the time, and Moscow maintained absolute silence. Inside the Soviet space program, a different story circulated. Training officers whispered about candidates pushed into missions with untested life support systems. Engineers recalled capsules rushed to the launch pad despite unresolved structural defects. Some insiders privately believed that several cosmonauts had been launched before Gagarin, not as historic pioneers, but as experimental subjects, sacrificed to perfect the mission profile that Gagarin would eventually use. The Soviet Union's obsession with being first did not allow space for caution. The pressure to surpass the United States forced the program into a cycle of secrecy, denial, and quiet disposal of failure. In official archives, gaps appeared where personnel files should have been. Time-stamped photographs showed inconsistencies in group compositions. And in classified minutes of high-level meetings, the phrase, "heroic deaths in the line of socialist progress," appeared far more often than state media ever suggested. By the early 1960s, foreign radio enthusiasts and intelligence agencies around the world began noticing a growing list of anomalies. Recordings surfaced of signals that sounded like emergency transmissions, irregular breathing, failing systems, desperate telemetry pings, and static-filled wheezing that abruptly ended mid-transmission. None of these signals corresponded to any known Soviet mission. The voices could not be identified. Their missions were never acknowledged. and their spacecraft were never recovered publicly. As the Cold War intensified, the Soviet Union doubled down on concealment. The space program became a fortress of secrecy, guarded by strict censorship laws and the threat of lifelong punishment for anyone who leaked information. This created a perfect environment for legends and possibly truths about missing cosmonauts to thrive. Yet one fact remained undeniable. The Soviet space program had losses, and the government went to extraordinary lengths to hide them. Part 1 ends as the world begins to suspect that these mysterious transmissions, the so-called voices lost in space, were not technical errors, nor random noise, but the final moments of human beings erased from history, the moment they disappeared beyond Earth's atmosphere. By the time the 1960s began, the Soviet space program had perfected the art of rewriting reality. Every launch was framed as a triumph, every setback reframed as minor turbulence on the path to inevitable victory. But beneath the orchestrated displays of confidence, Soviet technicians knew the truth. Their rockets were powerful, but unstable. Their capsules were innovative, but dangerously incomplete. And their early missions were not achievements. They were experiments conducted under immense political pressure. Inside the sprawling complex of Baikonur Cosmodrome, the atmosphere was tense. Engineers worked around the clock inside workshops that vibrated from the force of prototype rocket engines being tested nearby. The pressure grew with each announcement made by the United States, each test flight declared by NASA, each newspaper headline suggesting America might pull ahead. The Kremlin demanded superiority. The military demanded results. And the scientists were left to transform unfinished technology into history-making machines. This pressure created a phenomenon the outside world could only guess at, a series of launches that never appeared in Soviet records. These missions were stripped of their serial numbers, removed from manifests, and erased from official archives before they even left the ground. The individuals assigned to them were drawn from the earliest cosmonaut candidate groups, young pilots with strong bodies, disciplined minds, and ambitions shaped by propaganda. They were willing to do whatever their country demanded, and the country demanded far more than they imagined. These early launches were often conducted with extreme secrecy. Sometimes they occurred at night. With skeleton crews and minimal documentation, technicians recalled prototypes rolled to the launch pad in silence, floodlights barely illuminating their surfaces, guards posted to prevent any unauthorized personnel from approaching. When these rockets lifted off, only a handful of people knew they were carrying human passengers. Not all of them reached orbit, not all of them came down intact, and not all of them returned to places where recovery teams could operate safely. During this period, unexplained debris fell in remote regions of the Soviet Union. Shepherds stumbled across twisted metal fragments with markings that resembled early Vostok designs. Some pieces were confiscated immediately by military units who arrived unusually quickly for such remote territories, a sign that they had been tracking the fall long before civilians spotted it. Just beyond the borders of the USSR, foreign radio operators began to detect patterns that didn't fit with the official Soviet timeline. The signals came at odd hours, often weak and distorted, but unmistakably structured. They included telemetry bursts consistent with life support systems failing, capsule temperatures rising beyond safe limits, and heart monitor data exhibiting patterns of extreme stress. These signals were not made public at the time. Instead, they were archived privately by those who captured them: Italian brothers, French engineers, British hobbyists, and even U.S. military listening posts. Over time, the collected recordings formed a disturbing mosaic, the image of a space program willing to gamble with human lives in secret long before presenting polished success to the world. Inside the Soviet Union, secrecy expanded further. Cosmonaut training centers began removing certain names from rosters without explanation. Group photographs were edited to hide individuals who had recently participated in classified flights. Family members of vanished cosmonauts received visits from officials who offered pensions, forced silence, and vague assurances that their sons had served the motherland honorably. Yet despite these efforts, small clues seeped through the cracks. In early training manuals circulated among candidates, certain mission numbers appeared briefly before being removed in later printings. Internal memos referenced unacknowledged tests conducted under direct military authority. And among the first generation of cosmonauts, rumors persisted about predecessors whose missions had ended in catastrophe. Western analysts puzzled over inconsistencies in Soviet launch announcements. Certain days showed clear signs of rocket activity, increased communications from tracking stations, radar signatures consistent with launches, elevated military presence at key sites, but no official Soviet statements followed. These silent launches became known informally within intelligence circles as ghost flights. Reports compiled by early U.S. intelligence units suggested that the Soviets suffered numerous failures in their attempts to perfect orbital reentry systems. Capsules entered the atmosphere too steeply, disintegrated from heat, or impacted the ground at severe velocities due to parachute malfunctions. If these capsules carried human occupants, no recovery was possible. As the Soviets prepared to send Yuri Gagarin on his historic mission, internal documents indicated that several earlier attempts had already been made to achieve manned orbit. These attempts were not publicized for one simple reason: they did not succeed. Meanwhile, independent radio operators continued capturing unexplained signals. Some sounded like failing life support systems, gasping for seconds of functionality. Others appeared to show rising carbon dioxide levels and abnormal heart rate patterns, suggesting panic or loss of consciousness. A few recordings captured faint breathing or static-covered physiological data that abruptly terminated. What disturbed analysts was not the existence of these transmissions, but their timing. Many occurred before April 12, 1961, the date the USSR claimed to have launched the world's first manned spaceflight. Privately, some intelligence officers suspected that Gagarin was not the first to leave Earth, only the first to come back alive. But the Soviet Union denied every claim. When recordings of the mysterious signals were released in later decades, Soviet officials dismissed them as fabrications, technical misinterpretations, or deliberate Western propaganda. Yet their explanations consistently failed to align with physical evidence. Burn patterns on recovered debris, corroborating accounts from former Soviet engineers, and inconsistencies in early cosmonaut lists that could not be explained away by clerical errors. The deeper researchers dug, the more they found themselves confronting a troubling possibility: that entire missions had been intentionally erased not after they failed, but before they even launched. This meant the program had deliberately created cosmonauts who were never meant to be acknowledged, individuals who existed only as long as their missions remained viable. If they survived, they became heroes. If they did not, they became secrets. By the mid-1960s, the Soviet space program had perfected the model. Present sanitized triumphs to the world while burying failures under layers of state censorship. But the ghosts of those early missions refused to stay hidden. The recordings continued to circulate quietly among researchers. The missing cosmonaut photographs became objects of obsession, and the unexplained anomalies in launch records raised more questions than answers. The legend of the Lost Cosmonauts was no longer just a rumor. It had become an unresolved chapter in space history, one that pointed to a darker truth behind the Soviet Union's greatest achievement. The archives that don't match the history. As the Soviet space program pushed deeper into the 1960s, its public image became increasingly polished, even theatrical. Photographs of smiling cosmonauts appeared in newspapers across the world. Public appearances were carefully staged, medals awarded in ceremonies designed to project scientific mastery. But beneath this modern facade, the machinery that produced these victories remained opaque, a labyrinth of military oversight, political pressure, and silence. Inside this system, records were not simply kept, they were managed. Files were locked away in restricted vaults, launch logs were revised retroactively, and internal memos were rewritten to align with evolving political narratives. The Soviet Union did not merely hide information, it reshaped it. When missions failed, their documentation disappeared. When individuals perished in classified tests, their names were removed from personnel lists as though they had never existed. Yet even the most meticulous censorship left faint traces. Over time, researchers uncovered discrepancies so subtle they could only have emerged from human error: altered time stamps, duplicated identifiers, mismatched serial numbers on rocket components. These anomalies appeared sporadically in archives released after the fall of the USSR, pointing to missions that official histories claimed had never occurred. Among the most striking inconsistencies were early cosmonaut rosters. Preliminary lists contained more names than later versions, suggesting that certain candidates were removed retroactively. Many of these individuals were young military pilots who completed intense training but never appeared in public. Their disappearance from the records coincided with periods of unusual launch activity at Baikonur days when tracking stations activated, but no public mission was announced. The Soviet Union had always controlled its narrative, but these shadows implied something more disturbing: a controlled narrative built over the erasure of human lives. Meanwhile, the mysterious radio transmissions continued to surface. Throughout the early 1960s, independent operators around Europe detected automated beacons, emergency pings, and tonal sequences identical to known Soviet spacecraft telemetry. Intelligence agencies quietly analyzed these anomalies. Reports compiled by NATO listening posts compared the transmissions with known Soviet communication protocols and found striking matches. Several transmissions indicated that capsules reached orbit but lost communication shortly afterward. Others suggested failing life support systems, rapid pressurization drops, or radiation spikes consistent with solar flare exposure. A few signals abruptly cut off, implying catastrophic failure. What alarmed analysts was the lack of any official Soviet acknowledgement on the days these transmissions appeared. If these signals were genuine, they represented missions that were never publicly admitted, flights that ended in silence and were buried in secrecy. By the mid-1960s, rumors of lost Soviet astronauts had reached both Western media and intelligence circles. Some dismissed the claims as disinformation. Others saw them as plausible, given the secrecy surrounding early spaceflight. But the most compelling evidence surfaced decades later, when Russian insiders began speaking more freely about the Soviet era. Former engineers described prototype capsules launched before the Vostok design was finalized, vehicles that lacked critical safety features. They referred to missions intended not for exploration, but for data collection, human endurance tests, re-entry experiments, long-duration trials. These missions carried enormous risks, and the outcome depended entirely on variables that were far from understood. Some insiders spoke of flights that never returned, capsules that re-entered the atmosphere at lethal angles, parachutes that failed to deploy, recovery teams that were deployed not to rescue a cosmonaut, but to erase evidence. The individuals involved were forced to sign lifelong confidentiality agreements, and any surviving family members were instructed never to speak publicly. One of the most troubling themes in these testimonies concerned physical remains. Several recovery workers described retrieving scorched capsule fragments, sometimes with evidence of human occupancy. These remains were transported directly to military medical facilities, processed under strict supervision, and stored in classified morgues that remained inaccessible for decades. None of these accounts have been officially confirmed, Yet they align with discrepancies in launch logs, unannounced rocket tests, and unexplained orbital objects tracked by Western radar systems. These fragments collectively form a mosaic that official Soviet history cannot fully explain. The most controversial element of the Lost Cosmonauts story revolves around photographic evidence. Some early cosmonaut group photos exist in multiple versions, with subtle differences. In one version, a young pilot appears standing near the center. In the later version, he is missing. His absence is not explained by dismissal or reassignment. He simply vanished from the historical record, leaving no trace in official biographies or mission assignments. Such alterations were not limited to photographs. Newspapers printed during the early space race occasionally hinted at imminent announcements or celebrations, only for those events to disappear from subsequent editions. Some foreign newspapers received tips from Soviet sources about upcoming flights that never materialized, as though the launches had been canceled at the last minute or had taken place and ended disastrously. Even decades after the fall of the Soviet Union, researchers encountered restricted files in Russian archives labeled with vague descriptors such as unsuccessful test phase or non-standard launch sequence. These files reference dates and technical parameters that matched the timing of reported anomalous signals captured by Western radio operators. Inside these restricted documents, there were redacted sections where cosmonaut identifiers should have been. This pattern suggested that test missions were conducted with human payloads, not mannequins, and that the outcomes were deemed too damaging to reveal. As the years passed, Western analysts pieced together a chilling pattern. Each time the Soviet Union prepared to announce a major achievement, one or more unacknowledged test flights occurred shortly beforehand. These test flights were consistent with rehearsals intended to validate hardware for official missions. If those preliminary flights ended in failure, the failures were concealed. Only the final, successful mission was announced to the world. The deeper historians and researchers investigated, the more the official timeline of Soviet spaceflight seemed less like a record of human triumph and more like a carefully edited narrative. What remained invisible were the casualties that helped shape the program's eventual success, individuals whose contributions were buried under layers of secrecy. Today, the question of the lost cosmonauts remains unresolved. No definitive proof has surfaced, yet the inconsistencies are too numerous to ignore. If these individuals existed, they were pioneers who ventured into the most dangerous frontier at a time when the risks were scarcely understood. They may have died alone in the silence of space, or in fiery re-entry attempts that failed before the world ever knew their names. Their legacy, if it exists, lies not in public memorials or printed history, but in the gaps, the missing files, the altered photographs, the unexplained transmissions, and the silences that surround the darkest years of the Soviet space program. And in those silences, the truth continues to echo. The silence that survived the collapse. When the Soviet Union finally dissolved in 1991, researchers around the world hoped the truth would finally surface. It was the first time in history that the archives of a fallen superpower might reveal what decades of secrecy had buried. Boxes of documents were unsealed, classified registers were loosened, and former officials began speaking about their roles during the Cold War. But when investigators reached the files related to early spaceflight, they discovered an unsettling pattern. The records were either incomplete, heavily redacted, or missing altogether. Launch logs for certain dates simply did not exist. Technical reports referenced projects that had no accompanying personnel files. Photographs meant to document the first cosmonaut classes showed visible signs of retouching, cropping, or rearrangement. The gaps remained not accidental, but intentional. Some former engineers quietly admitted that, even in the final years of the USSR, the existence of certain missions was considered too politically dangerous to reveal. These individuals described an internal culture where failures were scrubbed from history, where unsuccessful launches were recorded under generic test categories, and where any mission involving human casualties was sealed permanently under state security provisions that survived the collapse of the government itself. Western intelligence agencies declassified their own findings as well. Radar logs from the early 1960s showed unidentified orbital objects behaving like manned capsules. Monitoring stations recorded unscheduled bursts of telemetry originating from Soviet flight corridors. Analysts reported unusual activity at recovery bases on days when no official launches had been announced. These records did not prove the existence of the lost cosmonauts, but they deepened the mystery in ways that made official Soviet explanations increasingly difficult to accept. Independent historians attempted to reconstruct the missing timeline through fragments, intercepted signals, censored photographs, internal memos leaked during the chaotic early 1990s. Their analyses revealed clusters of anomalies around key Soviet milestones, silent launches that appeared to precede the celebrated ones. The implication was unmistakable. The triumphs the world remembered may have been built upon unacknowledged attempts that ended in tragedy. Over time, the legend of the lost cosmonauts became more than a conspiracy theory. It evolved into a symbol of the sacrifices buried beneath authoritarian secrecy, a reminder that the space race was not only a battle for technological supremacy, but a struggle in which human lives were treated as expendable assets. Today, the truth remains elusive. No definitive proof has emerged, yet no credible explanation has ever fully accounted for the inconsistencies. The Soviet archives still hold sealed compartments. Russian officials still dismiss the claims without offering transparent evidence, and the families whose sons vanished from early cosmonaut rosters remain tied to silence shaped by decades-old agreements. The unanswered question lingers in the shadows of history. Did the pioneers who reached for the stars become victims of a state determined to win at any cost? Their names, if they existed, may never be known. Their missions may forever remain unrecorded. But their absence, the empty space in the Soviet narrative, speaks louder than any official denial. And in that silence, the lost cosmonauts continue to orbit the edge of history, suspended between fact and erasure.